After I was a student composer, I was not a composer, and I was a music critic and a writer. And then at around about the time in 1976 that Peter began to need specially composed soundtracks, I had independently become a composer again, and I formulated a musical style that is kind of recognizably Mychael Nyman, and I wrote my pieces, and Peter Greenaway invited me to either write new music for his films into films that had a very different kind of narrative style and didn't really involve actors. And what was interesting is whatever narrative there was in these films was a kind of artificial, kind of pseudo-documentary narrative rather than a novelistic narrative. It meant that I could write music that lasted continuously throughout a film. There were generally no silences, and I could write pieces of music that were complete in themselves and totally self-contained. So the 5 or 6 films that I did before the Draftsman's Contract actually gave me much more freedom as a composer than I suppose any other films have in the 32 years since 1976.
The 21st map, the map of a conscientious cartographer. This map had been a legal orthodox buy from an antiquarian's bookshop. It had been kept in a map cabinet. It had been exchanged in daylight for an authorized check. There had been a receipt. Yet, for all that, I never felt the map was mine. I'd kept it hidden. Perhaps that had helped preserve the pencil marks from fading.
Peter and I agreed that the only agreement we had about the music, or the only really serious instruction he gave me, was that the music should be, the origins of the music should be contemporary with the setting, with the date of the, historical date of the film, which was the last decade of the 17th century.
I wish you, Thomas, to be a discretionable witness. Discretionable in my interest and in yours. To an unorthodox agreement that would discredit me irreparably, if discovered.
The conditions of the agreement, Mr. Noyes, are my services as draftsman for 12 days for the manufacture of 12 drawings of the estate and gardens, parks and outlying buildings of Mr. Herbert's property.
And I'd already demonstrated to myself and to Greenaway that it is possible, and he acknowledged this, to write a piece of music that exists in simultaneously in the period of composition and also the period of recomposition, with a piece that I wrote in 1977 called In Re Don Giovanni, which takes the first 16 measures of the catalogue song from Don Giovanni and deconstructs it, I suppose, turns it into a kind of rock and roll, but a very serious, analytical, musicological rock and roll. And Greenaway actually took the existence of that piece and the cleverness of that piece as a model not only for the music of the Draftsman's Contract, but it gave him the confidence and the courage to realize that he could make a film that looked as though it lived in the 17th century, but in fact was dealing with issues about property, about the position of women, etc., that was very much of the early 80s. The other instruction that Peter gave me was that in order for the spectator, the audience, to identify the time and place of each of these drawings, each drawing should have a specific and recognizable piece of music attached to it. So I kind of found 12 pieces of Henry Purcell, and each one was associated with a particular drawing drawn from a particular angle. I decided to make a musical parallel with the way that the draftsman would start with a blank page and add certain marks progressively day after day, so the page became more and more full of detail. So I wrote my 12 pieces of music, which also were kind of built up from next to nothing, just a bass line, to a kind of dense texture. And the piece of music that you hear at the beginning of the film was supposed to represent the first drawing as it was completed. So this was the most elaborate, the most complex version of this music. And the interesting thing about Peter is that intellectually he would have all these structures and strictures and control systems, but that as soon as he heard this particular piece of music, which, as I say, was supposed to represent the 6th day of drawing, he responded to it like a sort of fan and said, oh, this is perfect for the opening scene of the film. And I thought, well, fuck you, why have I gone through this extremely kind of stringent and strict process of creativity, at your instructions, paralleling your visual processes, when this system immediately becomes rejected in favor of something which is more an aesthetic choice than a structural choice. I mean, the relationship with Greenaway was, at the time, and certainly in retrospect, fantastic. So the challenges from Greenaway to remake 17th century music in the light of 20th century music, it's pretty obvious that that I feel very comfortable with Baroque music. I feel very comfortable with the rhythmic structure of Baroque music, with the kind of repetition. It's very obvious that with a very, very simple addition of a certain style of playing and certain kinds of bass lines, it's possible very easily to transform the 17th century into the 20th century without destroying. So this music is never pastiche. Greenaway's practice of making films was always to want and to need the music to be composed either before the film was shot, while he was shooting, or while he was editing, because that's what satisfied him as a filmmaker who was an ex-film editor. And the piano music for La Leçon de Piano had to be written before the film was shot for purely pragmatic reasons, namely that Holly Hunter in the film plays the piano. If she plays the piano, she has to have some music to play. If she has to have some music to play, it has to be written before she goes on location. Simple as that. I don't think any other composer has been asked, as I was asked by Jane, to write, actually to create the compositions of an amateur composer, which is what I consider the Holly Hunter character to be, because my interpretation of Holly Hunter, the character, was that she didn't speak, she played the piano as a substitute for speech. So it would have been very easy to write, or for Jane to give her kind of Mendelssohn to play, but, you know, that would not have been Holly's voice. So that's another kind of unique task that I was given as a composer, very different from the Greenaway tasks, because the Greenaway tasks have nothing to do with emotion and have nothing to do with character.
I trusted you.
But what is interesting about that sequence is that piece of music that I wrote was composed for and is initially heard when Holly Hunter is reunited with her piano on the beach. So it's a piece of music that I conceived as being full of joy, and it really shocked me when I saw a rough cut of the film, when I discovered that Jane had not only used the same piece of music for a sequence which is precisely the opposite of joyful, but also used exactly the same recording. And, you know, we could sit here and discuss, you know, what music means, you know, till midnight, and it sort of still puzzles me and excites me that a piece of music can have at least two totally opposite meanings, if music has any meaning. And the other thing as a soundtrack composer is that it actually saved me a huge problem of having to write a kind of genre music which would express directly what you see going on in that scene. I far prefer writing music that is kind of abstract, that the director perceives something concrete in, rather than having to do what soundtrack composers generally do, which is to write a piece of music which specifically has to express whatever you see on the screen or whatever the director wants you to feel. So I'm very grateful for Jane for having perceived the opposite in that piece of music from what I intended, because as we say in English, it got me off the hook.